There are two gangs at war in aviation. The names are LOP and ROP. We're going to be talking Lena Peak in the hangar. I'm Dan Millican, and welcome to In the Hangar, sponsored by Wingfield Aviation. When you need somebody with service and transparency, Wingfield Aviation is the place for your aircraft. We're going to be talking about Lena Peak, Richard Peak. We've got a couple of people here who are going to represent both sides, both gangs, as you will. So joining me today, we've got Joe Johnson coming back. Joe, DPE, you're a 121 pilot. You've been around aviation just about all your life, even maybe even before you were born.
Probably.
All right, over here on the far side, so on my right and on my left is Martin Pauly. Martin, you started aviation in another country and came here. Yeah. And so you've had many, many hours of GA experience.
That's right. I started flying gliders, as lean of peak as you can, I guess.
Doesn't get any leaner than that. And in the middle, refereeing, we've got John Wingfield. John, you are we've talked about it before in previous shows. You're very OCD, which is a good thing when it comes to aircraft maintenance. So at least you can kind of maybe keep these sides apart where there's not too much bloodshed.
Right.
All right, so there we go.
Goal.
Okay, before we get into the warring and the battling that'll go on, let's first define what is Lena Peak, what is Richard Peak? Who wants to define it?
Sure. So when we're flying, as you pull the mixture knob from full ridge to lean, there's a pretty broad range, from ridge to lean, at which the engine will happily run. You get good combustion, you get power. And a few things change, though, as you move the mixture knob during that range. And one of them is the exhaust gas temperature. And starting in full ridge, the temperature goes up, reaches a peak, and then as you lean further, it goes down again. Lean of peak, by definition, simply means that we're operating with a mixture where we've crossed that peak EGT, and the mixture is leaner than it has to be to reach the maximum exhaust gas temperature.
Okay, so just for those who maybe not quite, maybe a student pilot, you talk about pulling the mixture knob. Let's go to real basics. What is, in a piston engine, what does pulling a mixture knob do?
When you lean it out, you're, in essence, decreasing the amount of fuel that's going into that cylinder. Not necessarily decreasing the air, that's with your throttle, but decreasing the fuel that's going in. And so the byproduct of that can be less fuel for combustion, but also less cooling ability for the engine, and that's reflected in CHTs, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later. But you pull that out, you're reducing the amount of fuel that's being shot into that cylinder.
Okay, good. All right, so there we have a basic definition of Lena Peak and Richard Peak. So, and I guess it sounds like it's really defined by temperature, isn't it? Or it's not defined, but it's measured by temperature. At least that's where you can start to see that peak is where, in a very simplistic manner, I add fuel to cool the engine, but there's a part where I add so much fuel it actually can heat it back up. Or did I just say that backwards?
I think you meant the other way.
The other way, yeah. So, but anyway, that's what I get for being backwards. But you get my point, is that there's a peak where you're doing one thing to get the engine one way, and all of a sudden you reach a part where it does the opposite. So, and that's where you go over the peak to the lean side. Okay, good. So I managed to muddy that up a little bit. So what is the advantage? We'll start with Martin. What is the advantage of running Lena Peak?
Well, if you look at the internet forums, there are a lot of advantages listed, but there are two that are really key from my perspective. One is efficiency. If you want to get the most miles out of your gas, nautical miles per gallon, lean of peak is the way to achieve that. And the other one is the cylinder head temperatures. Metal gets weaker when it gets too hot, so keeping your CHTs under control is an important part of managing the engine, especially with high-performance engines. And CHTs are on the cool side when operating lean of peak. You'd have to go very, very far to the ridge of peak side at high power settings to get similarly cooled CHTs.
Okay. And you're talking about measuring your EGTs, your CHTs quite a bit. Are you using the old school analog engine gauge that basically has a green area and a C and an H?
No, I don't. My airplane, it's a Bonanza single engine piston, has a digital engine monitor. It has probes for cylinder head temperature and exhaust gas temperature for each cylinder individually. Because each cylinder is kind of working on its own, right? And as much as we would like an engine to be perfectly set up that the fuel and air distribution between these cylinders is the same, that's not really happening. So to get the full picture of how your engine is working, you need a readout for each cylinder. And that could be an analog or a digital gauge, but I have never seen analog instrumentation in an airplane
For each cylinder.
Right. They take one cylinder or combine the exhaust gas on one side, from the exhaust and get a reading that way.
Joe, what is wrong about running LOP?
Well, lean to peak, you've got your engine at max efficiency.
Okay.
All right, so as he stated, you are getting the most miles, if you will, per gallon. There's a couple of things with that from a standpoint, not from a mechanical standpoint, from a planning standpoint, that if you are planning your flight to run lean of peak in order to make your destination, you've already backed yourself into a corner.
Okay, fair enough.
That being said, if I needed to go rich of peak for the power to get myself out of a situation, I've now you understand where the planning comes from, right? I estimated I'd need 10 gallons, as long as I run 2 gallons an hour. But now something's happened. I can't get to the altitude. I've been held lower. When it's necessary, winds, and now I've got to run 4 gallons an hour. I just cut my fuel efficiency in half, and now I'm not going to make destination. And depending on where you're going, that could be, fairly critical. The other aspect that I see with that I oftentimes will say is that it takes a lot of gallons saved to buy one cylinder. Because the air, when you run on the other side of the lean, shock cooling becomes a big issue as you start down, and because you've got to enrich in the mixture as you come down. And again, with a digital monitor and properly monitored, it can be done, but most people don't put the time and effort into it. They buy the gaming injectors, they buy the digital, and they don't educate themselves. And then they're at a shock when the mechanic says, you got 3 cracked cylinders this annual, and we're going to need to replace those at $2,000 a piece. And I go, well, there's $6,000. Dad would have bought a lot of avgas at $4 a gallon or $5 a gallon.
Well, I find it interesting, Martin, when asked what's the advantage of running lean of peak, you did not mention money. You didn't mention the gallons of avgas you save. I thought that was interesting.
Well, I think that's equivalent, right? By saving avgas, I save money, or I can increase my range.
Right. Okay.
And maybe save a fuel stop on a long trip.
Because I guess...
Okay, I'm going to throw the first punch here.
Okay.
I fly Bonanza as well. So F-33, you're in a... A36. So similar aircraft. Okay. You run the 300 horse, the 550, or the 520?
285.
Okay, so we're running the exact same engine. Gaming injectors?
Yes.
All right, so I have the gaming injectors. I have the JPI 930.
I do too as well.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're running almost identical airplanes. Now
this is great.
Yeah, this is really good because I run rich of peak and I won't flight plan my airplane beyond 2.5 hours. With 80 gallons of gas, I won't flight plan IFR beyond 2.5 hours with reserves, just because I don't want to find myself in a situation where I don't have the gas. But if I need it, I can always fall back on his methodology and go lean and peak and stretch myself, from a planning standpoint. I'm also a go fast person. I like to go fast.
Right.
So I'm willing to spend $15 extra on that flight to get there an hour sooner.
And I would say, just me personally, I've run lean of peak. I know how to run lean of peak. That is why I don't run lean of peak any more than I do, is because I want to get there. I've got a crew. We've been shooting. I want to get back home. I don't want to lose. I'll lose 8 to 10 knots running lean of peak.
Yeah, it can be more depending on your altitude.
Yeah. And if you want the best speed, there is nothing wrong with going rich of peak.
Right. Okay, so first punch thrown. You guys are flying the same thing. So with Martin running Lena Peak like he does, how can you objectively say he's ruining his cylinders? You know, or is he going to have those cracked cylinders? I mean, how could it be that the people that you know that have cracked their cylinders that run Lena Peak, maybe it was something else? Mismanagement.
9 out of 10 times it's mismanagement.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to be very disciplined. It's almost like an art form. And if you don't manage it properly, you will start cracking cylinders or blow a jug
All
altogether.
right. So you're saying you're not anti-LOP, Lena Peak.
I just don't do LOP.
You're saying if somebody does it, they have to do it right. And it's not an easy thing to do
That's
right.
not.
Well, to Joe's earlier point, it requires an understanding of what it is and how you interpret the information from your engine monitor, right? Where people have gotten into trouble and gotten the engines too hot, by trying to run Lena Peak, is typically when they lean a little bit, but they don't go far enough to the lean side.
Right.
They go to that area where the temperatures, the CHTs, and also the pressures inside the cylinders reach a maximum, and that's dangerous for the engine. So if you experiment without really knowing, what should I target, how lean should I go, there is a place between healthy ridge of peak and healthy lean of peak that is bad for the engine, and takes education to know where that is.
Okay. You mentioned shock cooling.
Correct.
Let me hit on that for a minute because I was talking to a cylinder manufacturer, their chief engineer kind of guy. He said shock cooling is a myth today. He said with the metallurgy that they've done in the last 40 years, that unless it's a big radial engine, I mean, you're shock cooling the engine when you turn it off. When you turn it off. So, what would you say to that? Now I'm throwing the punches, but
Right. So, with respect to the shock cooling and today's modern cylinders, if you're buying millennial cylinders and that type of stuff, I would agree that with the metallurgy that exists today, we're probably not as big of a risk as we were, 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
It's still a player. I mean, if you are just disregarding of how you operate the engine, and you've got this thing 50 degrees Lena Peak at 11,000 feet. Are you turbocharged or
Normally aspirated.
Normally aspirated. So he's up at 11,000, which is where we're going to operate. 9 to 11,000 is where that engine's happy, and they're running Lena Peak. And I'm sure he would never do this, but you'll see guys. They'll say, "Oh, it's top of descent. Time to start down." Right. Mm-hmm. And so they'll reach over there and throw the cowl flaps open and push the mixture full up and pull that power to idle. And next thing you know, on your digital monitor, it says you're doing 150, 200 degrees a minute cooling on that engine.
okay.
And now you can almost hear the cracking as it's occurring from under the cowling. So,
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. All right. And all right. So what else? Why do you think these two groups are so passionate? Because, I mean, looking at social media, and looking at the forums and, all the different places, whether it be Reddit, Pilots of America, or Facebook, and there's name calling. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff from the Lena Peak guys to the Richard Peak guys. Why? Why is this such a? It's like Trump versus Schiff,
Right.
or Pelosi. What's the deal? Why?
Yeah, that's a very interesting phenomenon, and I don't claim that I have to.
Am I just imagining it?
No,
it's out there. It's out
Well,
there.
it's not like pilots are type A personality.
No, not at all.
So you get us all in a room.
I wish they could be, have an opinion. Gosh.
A lot of it, I think, comes to again the real understanding of what goes on in the cylinder, the training of how should you run lean of peak and how should you run rich of peak. You can
mess it
run
up there
that
as
the
well.
wrong way and mess it up that way, right? And it's not something that is focused on very much during primary training, right? We have a lot of other things to do with students to take them to the private pilot's license. So many of these concepts are not fully understood by people unless those people voluntarily seek to learn about it.
Well, it's
And-
hard to learn about it because you go to one source and, they're name calling the other source. And I mean, everybody's just so vicious about it.
Typically, what I have seen in the past is that you will have an individual, let's say he's a Lena Peak individual, who's not as educated as my compadre here on this process, and he takes his aircraft out and he attempts to run Lena Peak based on some old timer's knowledge.
Right.
Well, just do this and do this and do this, and when you've got all the instrumentation, you'll be fine. And then he blows a cylinder or he cracks a cylinder. So now he becomes anti-Lena Peak. I tried that, and I cost me $2,500 for a cylinder. It cost me $3,000 in repair, $10,000, whatever the case may be. And vice versa, you have the guy that ran Richard Peak, and he had, he damaged his engine as well, because in the Richard Peak, where you have the extra fuel in the engine, now your cylinder head temperatures are going to run a lot hotter. Your EGTs will be lower, but your cylinder head temperatures are hotter because you got more gas in there burning. And there, as he stated, there's a fine art and a range where that engine likes to be. And if you're not there, you're cooking the engine on the top or the bottom.
Oh, okay. That's a good way to look at it. You're cooking the engine on the top or the bottom.
It is interesting that if we go back in time a little bit to the days of piston airplanes flying across the Atlantic in airline service, lean of peak was the way to do that, right?
That's correct.
And in World War II, lean of peak was a military secret because it gave bombers the range to cross long distances. Now in the jet age, there's not that necessity to go lean of peak, right? We don't need the range so much. We like to go fast. And we kind of forgot about it until about 20 years ago when this came up again. And piston pilots these days, for the most part, they fly rich of peak. They get slapped on the wrist if they try to touch the mixture knob during primary training. No, don't do that. We use that knob only to shut off the engine. A little exaggerated, but lean of peak was the norm a while ago. It still is the norm today. If you look at Cirrus, for example, Cirrus training is all based around lean of peak. That's how they teach. That's how the official training program
If you go
works.
to the Cirrus checkout, you're going to be taught to fly that aircraft lean of peak.
And if you go to the COPA board, there's no controversial discussion about it.
It's the
lean
way
of
it
peak.
is.
It's the way it is.
And the digital engine monitor and gaming is all about lean of peak.
Well, that's a really crucial thing is if anyone's going to consider running lean to peak, you've got to have a digital engine monitor with individual CHTs, EGTs. You've got a turbo with a TIT. And then on top of that, you, have to have an understanding of how it all works. And then, the fuel system setup is really crucial because if you understand it all and you've got all the monitoring, but your fuel starts off from the wrong baseline, you can't reach your top end fuel flow, and then you're not getting the cooling, and then you're kind of behind the curve and you're trying to chase the tail that you're never really going to catch. And so, making sure that the pilots or mechanics go through and properly set up the fuel system, which is, Continental M-0 in the maintenance manual, which their latest revision was 2017. Like that's the steps to follow. I think it's chapter 6. And then timing, making sure you're right on the timing or slightly retarded if you want to run lean at peak. Because if you're right up on that timing, you're going to kind of get into pre-detonation, pre-ignition, detonation, if you're running really close to that line. And that's when you get dangerous. And it's people that kind of know enough to be dangerous but don't know enough to not be dangerous. And that's when they're blowing up stuff. And so...
All right, so John, you fly a P210. Of course, it's turbo. It's the TSIO 520.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you run lean at peak?
I do, unless I really got to get somewhere. If I'm flying to Florida and I'm coming back in 40, 60 knot headwinds, I don't want this to be a 7-hour flight. I want it to be a 4-hour flight, And so if I've got a 60 knot tailwind, hey, I'll just pull that thing back. I'm still going to get there in under 3 hours. And so, for me, I know what settings to go to. I don't have to sit there and watch it. So I fly between 13 and 17,000 feet. I go to 30, 31 inches of manifold pressure because when you're lean at peak, manifold pressure is actually just airflow. It's not necessarily... You can change your throttle on lean at peak and you're not going to get any difference. So it doesn't really factor in
Right.
in the way that the book says as far as horsepower is concerned. So I go to 30-something inches, 2,500 RPM. My turbine or my turbo is rated for maximum continuous at 1650. So I go right to 1650. I know at 15.8 gallons an hour, at all those settings, I'm lean to peak, and I can be between 1620 and 1650 TIT, and I'm smooth sailing. I don't have any junk built up in my cylinders. Plugs are clean. Faces on my exhaust valves or little red hot pizzas, perfectly clean. And but if you don't do that right, then you're getting really close to dangerous cylinder pressures and temperatures. And my cylinders are 1650 a piece, and it takes a day of labor just to get to one side. So that adds up. And so, in rich at peak, you want to be, 100 degrees to rich at peak is the safe zone once you're richer than 100. 25 to 50, 50's on the safe end. But when you get too lean, depending on your timing, you can start feeling that missing in your feet. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, but if you get too lean, you'll just run out of, the engine will stop because you just cut off the gas. And so I think if you can run outside of that danger zone, that's a safe place to go. But rich at peak, I'm 20 gallons per hour, but I flight plan at rich at peak.
Right.
Because that's just a prudent thing to do.
I do too, yeah.
Yeah, and so.
What do you flight plan at Richard Peak?
I know what my endurance is, and my hard rule is I land with at least an hour of fuel left.
Right.
And the endurance that I start with is different when I want to go rich of peak than lean of peak, right? But either way, I have a time I start with, and that hour is a reserve that I must have at the end.
One thing we talked about, people don't know. I went through my private, of course. I'm in 152s. I remember my instructor told me, you pull back that mixture until you start to hear the engine run rough, and then do a quarter turn in. At that point, are most private pilot students? They're not even anywhere near touching the lean of peak, rich of peak argument.
Not in that. I know when I trained in a 172 with the G1000, so it was full-blown digital, and I think we leaned it out when we got in cruise, but we were still richer than that 100 degrees of rich at peak. We just weren't, we would cruise at like 8.5 gallons an hour at 3,000 feet at 2,400 RPM, and that's just so we're not burning fuel because it's our hourly rate is wet, and so at the end of the day, the flight school doesn't want to.
Yeah, well, flight schools aren't going to be running lean of peak anyway, and they're all just doing maneuvers and everything else. This is for long cross countries that this is really relevant for. If somebody's doing maneuvers at lean of peak, they're asking for trouble anyway.
I would say so.
Yeah, and I wouldn't do that at all either.
One interesting detail is if you lean the way you describe, right, and your engine can run lean of peak, say it's set up so that you've never tried it, you don't have the instrumentation, but the engine might be set up to run well lean of peak. If you pull the mixture knob till it gets rough and then just enrich it a little bit, you are lean of peak. You might be lean of peak, you might be rich of peak, you might have some cylinders rich of peak and others lean of peak. Without instrumentation, you don't know.
Oh, I know.
And
Yeah,
Well, I didn't know better as a student. They just said, keep pulling out. Okay, you hear it. No, it wasn't engine running rough. It's when you start to hear an RPM drop. You'll hear it. Listen for it. Okay, now go quarter in. I don't know. Was that wrong?
That was the same way I was taught as well.
Okay, you were. Okay.
I was shown the same thing. And I never just barely pushed it back in.
Oh, you went in.
I went in a couple of turns.
Well, that could be, I think we should mention that could be dangerous because if you look for maximum RPM, maximum horsepower, that's about 80 degrees rich of peak, and that at high performance with the high performance engines is a really, really bad place to be.
Well, I'm talking about the 152s in training, so that one.
Yeah, these engines don't have quite so much power. They're a lot harder to damage than. But if you were.
Yeah, the 0200 is pretty much bulletproof.
Yeah.
You can't hurt it.
So you can't, yeah. All right, what else? Anything else you guys want to add to the Lena Peak, Richard Peak argument?
Well, if we're going somewhere together, I'll send the cab back to pick him up.
Nice.
I'll buy the first round of rings because I saved a lot
You've
of money.
saved enough gas to do that.
Well, I think the main reason that I run lean to peak is my cylinder head temperatures are cooler, and so if the magic rule is you want to stay in cruise at 380 or below, and so at takeoff, if I get one up into 390, hey, okay, let me pitch down a little bit. You want to cruise at 380 or below. When you have CHTs at 420 compared to 380, there's 5 times the amount of metal that shows up on cylinders that run at 420 than they do at 380. And so you're getting damage and wear and tear. And so I think oil stops to exist at like 400, I think, right? It's not anything kind of post 400, oil doesn't, that's not a good place for it. And so it starts to break up. And so when you're getting up into that high temperature range, which on a hot day at a low altitude at full power, in my plane, it's hard to stay below 380s in my plane, so I've kind of forced to go lean to peak. But you're running into a danger zone of not being able to lubricate and cool the cylinders enough, or the parts of them, and lubricate them, and so that's just something to be mindful of. But I think for me, the big thing about lean at peak is just keeping my cylinder head temperatures cool. Mm-hmm. So, and you don't have to worry about the intake valve that's getting splashed with fuel. The exhaust valve, that's more of a inspect it with a borescope. That's more kind of a mechanical thing. But it's just about the integrity of the metal and the components in the cylinder in relation to the temperatures. So, if I was cost conscious, I probably wouldn't be flying in the first place because there's nothing really cheap about, flying.
That's a good point.
I've replaced a bunch of cylinders, and I also, I'm 89 usable gallons, so it's expensive either way, but I want that stuff to stay put and stay healthy for a long time.
Yeah.
And so for me, I like what I see on lean at peak, but you got to be on it, and you really got to watch it. And so if you got a bunch of distractions, I probably stare at that thing more in my OCD-ness than I should out the window as a VFR pilot. But you got to watch that stuff. That's really key.
All right, cool. All right, that's a good takeaway. And I think that what I'm taking away from this is how important it is to have a digital engine monitor if I'm going to try to do lean to peak, and how I really need to know what I'm doing, because if I don't, the risk of damaging my engine is significant. So I think those are good things to take away. So thank you guys for doing this. Joe, as always,
No worries.
John, and Martin, good to see you again.
Pleasure.
So, all right, you guys, treat your engines nicely no matter what you do. Lean at peak, rich at peak, just do it right. And we'll see you guys next time in the hangar.